One of the most significant ways prayer affects your life when dealing with a narcissistic person is that it restores your authority. Many people do not realize how much of their personal authority has been gradually taken from them until they begin the process of healing. Narcissistic individuals often operate through subtle tactics that slowly erode confidence, distort reality, and create dependence. It rarely happens overnight. Instead, it occurs through repeated experiences that cause you to question your instincts, doubt your judgment, and second-guess your decisions. Over time, you may find yourself constantly seeking approval, asking for permission to feel what you feel, or waiting for validation before trusting your own observations. This is where prayer becomes transformative. Prayer reconnects you to a source of truth that exists beyond the opinions, accusations, and manipulations of another person. When a person is trapped in a toxic dynamic, they often become consumed with trying to understand the narcissist. They analyze conversations, search for hidden meanings, and spend enormous amounts of emotional energy attempting to predict reactions. Their focus becomes fixed on the other person's behavior. The narcissist becomes the center of attention, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Prayer shifts that focus. Instead of centering your life around someone else's actions, prayer centers your life around God. The moment that shift begins, something powerful happens. You start realizing that your identity was never supposed to be built upon another person's approval. Your worth was never meant to fluctuate according to someone's mood, criticism, or praise. Prayer reminds you that your value is established by God and not determined by human opinion. This realization restores authority because authority begins with identity. A person who does not know who they are can easily be manipulated. A person who constantly questions their worth becomes vulnerable to control. When you forget your value, you become dependent on others to tell you who you are. A narcissist often takes advantage of that dependence by positioning themselves as the judge of your character, your abilities, your motives, and even your reality. Prayer interrupts that process by reminding you that God is the ultimate authority over your life. His perspective matters more than the opinions of those who seek to control you. As you spend time in prayer, you begin seeing yourself through God's eyes rather than through the distorted lens of manipulation. Many people who have experienced narcissistic abuse describe feeling as though they lost themselves. They no longer recognize the confident, joyful, and independent person they once were. They become hesitant to make decisions because they fear criticism. They become reluctant to express opinions because they anticipate conflict. They become cautious about setting boundaries because they expect punishment. Prayer gradually restores what has been diminished. It strengthens the inner person. It reminds you that wisdom is available. It reminds you that courage is possible. It reminds you that fear does not have to control your choices. Every time you pray, you are choosing to connect with a source of strength greater than your circumstances. Authority is not about dominating others. It is about having confidence in the truth. It is the ability to stand firmly in what you know without being shaken by manipulation. Narcissists often attempt to rewrite reality. They may deny events that occurred, minimize hurtful behavior, or blame others for their actions. This creates confusion because it causes you to question your memory and perception. Prayer provides clarity in moments of confusion. It creates space for reflection and discernment. Instead of reacting emotionally to every accusation or criticism, you begin seeking God's wisdom. As wisdom grows, confidence grows. As confidence grows, manipulation becomes less effective. Prayer also restores authority by helping you release responsibility for things that were never yours to carry. Many people in toxic relationships assume responsibility for the emotions, choices, and behaviors of others. They feel obligated to fix every problem, prevent every conflict, and manage every crisis. This burden becomes exhausting because it places impossible expectations upon them. Through prayer, you begin understanding the difference between what belongs to you and what belongs to someone else. You recognize that you are responsible for your actions, your choices, and your responses, but you are not responsible for controlling another person's behavior. This understanding is liberating because it removes unnecessary weight from your shoulders. As your authority is restored, fear begins losing its influence. Fear is one of the primary tools used by controlling individuals. They rely on fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of criticism, and fear of abandonment. These fears often keep people trapped in unhealthy situations long after they recognize something is wrong. Prayer strengthens your faith, and faith weakens fear. The more you trust God, the less power fear has over your decisions. You become willing to speak the truth even when it is uncomfortable. You become willing to establish boundaries even when they are unpopular. You become willing to choose peace even when others demand chaos. Another remarkable aspect of restored authority is the return of inner peace. When someone else has too much influence over your emotions, your peace becomes fragile. It rises and falls according to their behavior. If they are pleased, you feel relief. If they are upset, you feel anxiety. This creates emotional instability because your well-being becomes dependent on circumstances outside your control. Prayer changes that dynamic. It teaches you to anchor your peace in God rather than in people. The result is stability. You no longer feel compelled to chase approval or avoid conflict at all costs. Your confidence comes from knowing who you are and whose you are. As prayer continues shaping your heart and mind, you become less reactive and more intentional. You stop making decisions based solely on pressure, guilt, or fear. You begin responding from a place of wisdom and conviction. The opinions of others no longer carry the same weight they once did. You learn to trust God's guidance more than human manipulation. You learn to stand firm without becoming hostile. You learn to remain compassionate without becoming vulnerable to exploitation. You learn to walk in confidence without becoming prideful. The authority that prayer restores is not loud, aggressive, or controlling. It is quiet strength rooted in truth, faith, and unwavering confidence in God's presence. Prayer breaks fear and intimidation in ways that many people do not fully understand until they experience it for themselves. Fear is one of the most effective tools used by controlling individuals because it quietly influences thoughts, emotions, and decisions. A narcissistic person often does not need physical force to control someone. They can create an atmosphere where fear does the work for them. Fear of conflict, fear of criticism, fear of rejection, fear of humiliation, fear of abandonment, and fear of retaliation become invisible chains that keep people trapped in unhealthy patterns. Over time, a person may begin adjusting their behavior simply to avoid negative reactions. They may silence their opinions, ignore their needs, suppress their feelings, and sacrifice their peace in order to maintain temporary harmony. What began as occasional caution can eventually become a lifestyle of walking on eggshells. This is why prayer is so powerful. Prayer confronts fear at its root and replaces it with something stronger. When fear dominates a person's life, it affects how they see everything around them. Decisions become driven by anxiety rather than wisdom. Conversations become focused on avoiding trouble rather than expressing truth. Relationships become centered on managing reactions rather than building genuine connection. Fear narrows perspective and causes people to believe they have fewer options than they actually do. A narcissist often benefits from this because fearful people are easier to influence. They are less likely to challenge unhealthy behavior, less likely to establish boundaries, and less likely to walk away from toxic situations. Prayer disrupts this cycle because it redirects attention away from the intimidating person and toward the God who is greater than every circumstance. One of the most damaging effects of intimidation is that it convinces people they are powerless. The narcissist may appear strong, confident, and in control, while the other person feels small, uncertain, and overwhelmed. Over time, this imbalance can create a false perception of reality. The intimidated person begins believing that they cannot survive without the approval, acceptance, or cooperation of the one who controls them. Prayer challenges that belief. Every time a person enters God's presence, they are reminded that their strength does not come from human approval. Their security does not come from another person's acceptance. Their future is not determined by someone else's opinion. This realization begins restoring confidence that fear once stole. Fear thrives in uncertainty. It feeds on unanswered questions and imagined outcomes. Many people dealing with narcissistic individuals spend enormous amounts of time worrying about what might happen next. They anticipate arguments before they occur. They rehearse conversations in their minds. They prepare for criticism before any criticism is spoken. Their thoughts become consumed by possibilities and worst-case scenarios. Prayer interrupts this mental cycle by bringing focus back to the present moment and to God's faithfulness. Instead of allowing the imagination to create endless disasters, prayer reminds the heart that God is already present in every challenge that may arise. This does not mean problems disappear, but it changes how those problems are approached. A person who is ruled by fear often reacts emotionally. A person who is strengthened by prayer responds with wisdom. There is a significant difference between reacting and responding. Reaction is usually driven by anxiety, urgency, and emotion. Response is guided by clarity, discernment, and self-control. Narcissistic individuals frequently attempt to provoke emotional reactions because emotional people are easier to manipulate. When someone becomes angry, defensive, or desperate, they often lose perspective. Prayer helps restore perspective. It creates space between the trigger and the response. It allows a person to pause, seek wisdom, and act intentionally rather than impulsively. Prayer also weakens intimidation by strengthening trust. Intimidation works best when people believe they are alone. The feeling of isolation magnifies fear and makes challenges appear larger than they truly are. When a person feels unsupported, every threat seems more dangerous and every obstacle seems more overwhelming. Prayer reminds believers that they are never facing difficulties by themselves. God's presence becomes a source of courage. Knowing that God is with you changes how you face opposition. The intimidating words may still be spoken, the manipulative tactics may still be attempted, the pressure may still exist, but the fear attached to those things begins losing its power because your confidence is no longer dependent upon your own strength. Many people mistakenly assume courage means the absence of fear. In reality, courage often means moving forward despite fear. Prayer does not always remove every anxious feeling immediately. What it does is provide the strength necessary to keep moving forward even when fear is present. It enables a person to speak truth while their voice shakes. It enables them to establish boundaries even when they anticipate resistance. It enables them to make healthy decisions even when uncertainty remains. The more these acts of courage are practiced, the weaker fear becomes. What once felt impossible gradually becomes manageable. Another way prayer breaks intimidation is by exposing false beliefs. Fear often survives because people accept lies as truth. They may believe they are incapable, unworthy, helpless, or trapped. They may believe that standing up for themselves is selfish or that setting boundaries is wrong. They may believe they have no choice but to endure mistreatment indefinitely. Prayer creates opportunities for God to replace these lies with truth. As truth becomes clearer, fear loses its foundation. It becomes increasingly difficult for intimidation to control someone who knows their value, understands their rights, and trusts God's guidance. There is also a profound peace that emerges through consistent prayer. This peace is not dependent on favorable circumstances. It exists even when challenges remain unresolved. Narcissistic individuals often rely on creating emotional chaos because chaos weakens confidence and increases dependency. Prayer introduces stability into that chaos. It anchors the heart in something unchanging. Instead of being tossed back and forth by every criticism, accusation, or manipulation, a praying person develops emotional steadiness. They become less vulnerable to pressure because their sense of security is rooted in God rather than in circumstances. As fear diminishes, freedom increases. Decisions become clearer, boundaries become stronger, confidence becomes more consistent. The intimidating behavior that once felt overwhelming begins appearing far less powerful than it once seemed. This is not because the narcissist necessarily changes. It is because prayer changes the person who is living under the weight of fear. Their perspective changes, their confidence changes, their trust changes. They begin recognizing that intimidation only works when fear is allowed to rule the heart, and through prayer they discover a source of strength that fear cannot overcome. Prayer exposes hidden motives in a way that transforms how a person sees relationships, conversations, and the intentions behind people's actions. One of the most frustrating aspects of dealing with a narcissistic individual is the confusion that often surrounds their behavior. Their words and actions frequently do not match. They may speak kindly while secretly manipulating. They may present themselves as victims while causing harm to others. They may appear generous while expecting control in return. Because of these contradictions, many people find themselves trapped in a cycle of uncertainty. They sense that something is wrong, yet they struggle to identify exactly what it is. This confusion becomes exhausting because it forces them to constantly question their own perceptions. Prayer becomes powerful in these situations because it invites God's wisdom into areas where human understanding feels limited. Confusion is often one of the greatest weapons used by manipulative people. When a person is confused, they become easier to control. They hesitate to trust their instincts. They delay making decisions. They become dependent on others for interpretation and validation. A narcissist may intentionally create this confusion by sending mixed messages, changing expectations without warning, denying things they previously said, or shifting blame whenever accountability arises. Over time, these tactics can make someone feel as though they are losing touch with reality. They may begin wondering whether they are overreacting, misunderstanding, or imagining problems that do not exist. Prayer helps break through this fog by creating space for discernment and clarity. One of the remarkable effects of prayer is that it slows the mind down. When people are overwhelmed emotionally, they often struggle to think clearly. Their thoughts race, their emotions intensify, their fears grow louder than their wisdom. In that state, manipulation becomes difficult to recognize because everything feels urgent and personal. Prayer interrupts that emotional chaos. It allows a person to step back from the situation and seek God's perspective. Instead of focusing solely on what was said, they begin considering why it was said. Instead of concentrating only on actions, they begin noticing patterns. This shift is significant because hidden motives are often revealed through patterns rather than isolated events. Many people who have dealt with narcissistic individuals eventually realize that the problem was never a single conversation or one difficult moment. The real issue was a repeated pattern of behavior that became visible over time. Prayer sharpens awareness of these patterns. A person begins noticing that every disagreement somehow ends with them being blamed. They notice that apologies rarely lead to change. They notice that kindness is often used as a tool to regain control after conflict. They notice that conversations frequently revolve around the narcissist's needs while minimizing the needs of others. These observations may seem obvious in hindsight, but when someone is deeply involved in the relationship, they are often difficult to recognize. Prayer creates the clarity necessary to see what has been hidden in plain sight. Another way prayer exposes hidden motives is by helping people distinguish between appearances and reality. Narcissistic individuals are often highly concerned with image. They may work hard to maintain a positive reputation while behaving very differently behind closed doors. This discrepancy can be confusing because the public version of the person may seem completely different from the private version. Victims of manipulation often struggle with self-doubt because others only see the polished exterior. Prayer strengthens confidence in what is true rather than what merely appears true. It helps people trust God's wisdom even when external appearances tell a different story. Prayer also reveals motives by exposing emotional triggers. Manipulative people often know exactly how to provoke reactions. They understand which fears, insecurities, and vulnerabilities produce the strongest responses. They may use guilt to gain compliance. They may use criticism to create self-doubt. They may use praise to build dependency. Without awareness, these tactics can operate unnoticed for years. Through prayer, individuals become more conscious of their emotional responses. They begin asking important questions. Why did that comment affect me so deeply? Why do I feel guilty when I have done nothing wrong? Why do I feel pressured to fix problems that I did not create? These questions lead to greater understanding, and greater understanding weakens manipulation. Discernment is one of the greatest gifts developed through consistent prayer. Discernment goes beyond simply recognizing right from wrong. It involves understanding what is happening beneath the surface. It allows a person to perceive motives, intentions, and influences that are not immediately obvious. This ability becomes especially valuable when dealing with narcissistic personalities because their behavior is often layered and indirect. What appears to be concern may actually be control. What appears to be generosity may actually be manipulation. What appears to be vulnerability may actually be an attempt to avoid accountability. Prayer sharpens discernment so that people become less vulnerable to deception. Another important aspect of exposed motives is the ability to stop personalizing everything. Many people assume that if a narcissist is angry, critical, or manipulative, it must somehow be their fault. They internalize blame and carry responsibility for things they did not cause. Prayer helps separate another person's motives from your identity. It reminds you that someone else's behavior often reveals more about their character than it does about your worth. This realization is incredibly freeing because it reduces the emotional burden of constantly trying to please impossible expectations. As hidden motives become clearer, decision-making improves. Confusion often leads to hesitation, but clarity leads to confidence. A person who understands what is truly happening can make healthier choices. They can establish stronger boundaries. They can avoid unnecessary arguments. They can recognize manipulation before becoming entangled in it. Prayer provides the wisdom necessary to navigate complex situations without becoming overwhelmed by them. There is also protection in clarity. Many people remain trapped in toxic relationships because they cannot accurately identify the source of the problem. They keep hoping that circumstances will improve if they try harder, explain better, or sacrifice more. Prayer gradually reveals whether those hopes are realistic or misplaced. It helps people see situations as they truly are rather than as they wish them to be. While this truth can sometimes be painful, it is also liberating because freedom begins with honesty. As God's wisdom increases, the power of deception decreases. The things that once seemed confusing become easier to understand. The manipulation that once felt overwhelming becomes easier to recognize. The motives that once remained hidden begin coming into view. A person who prays consistently develops a deeper awareness of truth, and truth has a way of illuminating what darkness tries to conceal. When hidden motives are exposed, confusion loses its grip, discernment grows stronger, and manipulation becomes far less effective because what was once hidden can no longer operate in secrecy. Prayer creates healthy boundaries by changing the way a person understands responsibility, self-worth, and relationships. Many individuals who have spent significant time around narcissistic people struggle with boundaries because they have been conditioned to believe that meeting the narcissist's needs should always take priority over their own well-being. They may have learned that saying no leads to conflict, that expressing personal needs leads to criticism, or that protecting themselves leads to accusations of selfishness. Over time, they begin sacrificing their peace, their energy, and sometimes even their identity in order to maintain a relationship that constantly demands more from them. Prayer becomes a powerful force in breaking this pattern because it reconnects a person with God's wisdom and helps them understand that healthy boundaries are not acts of rejection, but acts of stewardship. One of the greatest misunderstandings about boundaries is the belief that they are designed to punish others. Many people hesitate to establish boundaries because they fear appearing harsh, unkind, or unforgiving. A narcissistic individual may reinforce these fears by reacting negatively whenever limits are introduced. They may accuse someone of being selfish, unloving, cold, or disloyal simply because that person is attempting to protect their emotional health. These reactions often create guilt, and guilt can become a powerful barrier to change. Prayer helps dismantle this barrier by reminding individuals that their decisions should be guided by truth rather than emotional manipulation. Through prayer, people begin seeking God's approval instead of constantly chasing the approval of those who resist accountability. Prayer also helps clarify what belongs to you and what belongs to someone else. One of the most exhausting aspects of dealing with narcissistic behavior is the tendency to absorb responsibilities that were never yours to carry. You may feel responsible for another person's happiness, moods, reactions, choices, or even consequences. If they become angry, you feel obligated to calm them. If they become upset, you feel pressured to fix the situation. If they experience discomfort, you may immediately assume it is your responsibility to remove it. This pattern creates an unhealthy imbalance because it causes you to invest enormous amounts of energy into managing another person's life while neglecting your own. Prayer brings clarity by helping you understand that every individual is accountable for their own actions. While compassion and kindness remain important, they do not require you to take ownership of responsibilities that belong to someone else. As prayer deepens, people often discover that boundaries are rooted in truth rather than emotion. Without prayer, boundaries are frequently established from a place of frustration. A person may become so overwhelmed that they react impulsively, creating limits based on anger or exhaustion. While these reactions are understandable, they can sometimes create additional conflict. Prayer allows boundaries to emerge from wisdom instead of emotional overload. It creates space for reflection and discernment. Instead of asking, "How can I make this person stop?" the focus shifts to, "What is healthy, wise, and honoring to God?" This change in perspective produces stronger and more sustainable boundaries because they are based on principles rather than temporary emotions. Narcissistic individuals often resist boundaries because boundaries limit access to control. They may be accustomed to unrestricted influence over another person's time, emotions, decisions, and attention. When those limits begin to appear, resistance is common. This resistance may take many forms. It may involve guilt trips, silent treatment, anger, manipulation, or attempts to portray themselves as victims. For someone who has spent years avoiding conflict, these reactions can feel intimidating. Prayer provides the courage necessary to remain firm even when boundaries are challenged. It strengthens the heart against fear and reminds individuals that opposition does not automatically mean they are doing something wrong. One of the most important lessons prayer teaches is that peace is valuable. Many people become so accustomed to chaos that they no longer recognize how much it is affecting them. Constant criticism, emotional drama, manipulation, and unpredictability can become normalized. They begin accepting stress as an unavoidable part of life. Prayer restores awareness of the peace God desires for his children. As that awareness grows, tolerance for unhealthy behavior often decreases. Individuals begin recognizing that protecting their peace is not selfish. It is an essential part of living wisely. Boundaries become a practical way of preserving that peace. Prayer also helps people overcome the fear of disappointing others. This fear is particularly common among those who have experienced manipulation. They become accustomed to measuring their success by how happy everyone else is. If someone becomes upset, they immediately assume they have failed. This mindset makes boundaries extremely difficult because boundaries inevitably disappoint people who are accustomed to unlimited access. Prayer shifts focus away from pleasing everyone and toward pleasing God. It reminds individuals that obedience to truth sometimes requires disappointing people who benefit from unhealthy patterns. While this realization can feel uncomfortable at first, it becomes increasingly freeing as confidence grows. Another significant benefit of prayer is that it strengthens self-respect. Narcissistic relationships often involve repeated violations of personal limits. Opinions may be dismissed, feelings may be minimized, and needs may be ignored. Over time, this treatment can erode self-respect because a person begins believing that their needs are less important than everyone else's. Prayer counters this belief by reminding individuals of their God-given value. When people truly understand their worth, they become less willing to tolerate behaviors that consistently undermine their well-being. Boundaries become an expression of that understanding. They communicate that personal dignity matters and that respect is not optional. Healthy boundaries also improve emotional stability. Without boundaries, life often becomes reactive. Every crisis becomes your crisis. Every demand becomes your responsibility. Every emotional outburst dictates the atmosphere around you. This creates constant instability because your emotional state becomes dependent on another person's behavior. Prayer helps establish internal stability by anchoring your identity in God rather than in circumstances. As that stability increases, boundaries become easier to maintain because they are no longer driven by fear or guilt. They become natural extensions of a healthy and grounded life. Prayer further teaches that love and boundaries can exist together. Many people mistakenly believe that setting limits means withholding love. In reality, healthy love requires healthy boundaries. Without boundaries, relationships often become distorted by control, resentment, and imbalance. Prayer helps individuals understand that they can be compassionate without being controlled, generous without being exploited, and forgiving without allowing continued harm. This balance creates healthier interactions and reduces opportunities for manipulation. As prayer continues shaping a person's heart, boundaries become less about keeping people out and more about preserving what God has placed within. They protect peace, guard emotional health, conserve energy, and create space for growth. They allow individuals to engage in relationships from a position of strength rather than fear. Instead of constantly reacting to pressure, they begin making intentional decisions rooted in wisdom. The confidence to establish these limits does not come from anger or pride. It comes from a growing understanding that God values truth, peace, and stewardship, and that healthy boundaries are one of the ways those values are expressed in everyday life.